Hi, I'm Stephen Vantassel. You're listening to Living the Wildlife, discussing all things related to vertebrate pest control as part of the Pest Geek podcast family. This is the disclaimer for Wildlife Control Consultant and Pest Geek podcast with Living the Wildlife podcast. Always follow national, state, provincial, and local laws when using pesticides and or other control methods to manage pests. Wildlife Control Consultant, LLC, Pest Geek Podcast, Living the Wildlife Podcast, Stephen M. Vantassel, or their or his affiliates are not responsible for followers' use of the information provided here. Hi everyone, Stephen Vantassel, Wildlife Control Consultant, bringing you another episode of Living the Wildlife as part of the Pest Geek Podcast family. Glad to have you on board. Hey, sorry I didn't have a podcast last week. I'm just buried. I've got way too much work to do right now, which is certainly a good thing. But I'm certainly appreciative of the outside work that I've been getting, but I've been a little buried. So I just didn't get through too many appointments and too many other obligations, and I just didn't get through it to get to it this past week. And I'm also traveling this coming week, so I thought I wanted to just put out a quick podcast for you. So just do me a favor, do take a moment, ring the bell, make sure you're subscribed to the channel. I'd certainly appreciate that. You can also reach out at me at wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. That's wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. Would love to hear your comments and thoughts. I'm excited. We're going to have Neem Quinn, Dr. Neem Quinn out of California. I'll be doing another interview with her. She has some additional research on her work with rodents out in California, and I'm looking forward to doing that interview in February, so stay tuned for that. Today, I'm just going to have a short presentation, so please bear with me. So let's get to it, because again, I've just been out straight, so I have not been able to do as much as I would like. So wanted to talk a little bit about rabies. I'm not going to go through all the elements of rabies here. I'm going to probably pick away at it, but I came across some interesting journal articles on the subject of how long does rabies last in a dead carcass. Now, those of you who've been listening to this podcast or heard me speak elsewhere, you know that I am a little emphatic about people wearing gloves when they're handling animals. I also think you should be wearing gloves when you are dealing with your cages and your equipment. Now, I know people get a little sloppy. I've gotten sloppy too. Familiarity breeds contempt. But I just want to reiterate, your job is dangerous, and you're exposed to a lot of organisms that your doctor may not always be familiar with, and you're going to get micro abrasions and cuts and scratches, and you're tough people out there. You're out there getting it done, and you're not going to notice a lot of these things. Then you're picking up a dirty cage, you're grabbing an animal that may have just groomed itself. I mean, it just opens up a host of issues that you want to avoid. The same holds true when you're dealing with dead carcasses. You're like, oh, okay, it's dead, it's not going to bite me. Well, that's certainly true. But is it still safe when it comes to rabies? And you want to just simply point out that no, it's not. And so this is some interesting work that was done. And so let's kind of go through this information relatively quickly. So this particular study was done in North Dakota, and what they were looking at situations where skunks were found on a roadkill. These were roadkill skunks. And they were finding that these animals were relatively positive at that right time. This was a study, I think, in 1970, before the 70s, and they were finding that like almost a third of these, or certainly over a quarter, I should say, of these skunks were positive for rabies, which is certainly troublesome. Now, obviously, these numbers rise and fall because there's epizootic events and, there's outbreaks of rabies in different parts of the country. And though that may have been the case in North Dakota during this time. But what the researchers wanted to do is they were like, how many negatives are false negatives? Now, just to kind of clear this up, you have what's called whenever you're doing a test, a laboratory test, you run the risk of having a false positive. That is, the test tells you an animal is rabid and it's not. And you also run the risk of having a false negative. That is, the animal is declared not having rabies when it does. And so the researchers wanted to know, well, we're getting 26% of these skunks are positive. How many are we missing when we're doing these tests? In other words, is the virus degrading on these roadkills, and so that when we're testing them, they're coming up negative when in fact more are actually positive than that. So what they did is they experimentally injected some skunks, and they then killed them and then put them outdoors they were putting them outdoors, I believe, in a controlled environment, in the sense that other animals are going to come in and predate on them or whatever. And these were the mean temperatures at 52 degrees to 85 degrees Fahrenheit. And then they tested the carcasses at different times. Excuse me. And what they found was that all of the skunks that they tested here, the ones that they were using in the study, and this was a relatively small study. I think they started with 20. 2 didn't even convert to being rabid. 2 ended up not... something was wrong with them, and so that didn't particularly. So they only had 14, 16 animals or so to work with. So what they found was that all the animals they tested, the ones that they ultimately used in their study, 100% were positive after 24 hours, in temperatures ranging from 52 to 85 degrees average. Then they tested again at 36 hours, and they found that only 79% were positive for rabies. Now, these were animals that were infected with the rabies virus. At 42 hours, 43% were positive for rabies. After 42 hours, all the animals were negative. So it shows you that as the animals degrading over time, it became harder and harder for them to confirm that rabies was in the organism. Now, that's way back in the 1970s, probably a lot before a lot of you were even born that are listening to my voice. Okay, so there's been some more recent research on this. And what some more recent research found is they were using mice carcasses. Obviously a much smaller animal, to be sure, but they were, again, a very controlled study. And they found that other research, this is, I'm sorry, I'm got a little ahead of myself here, my apologies. This other article was citing a previous study that found that animals that are exposed to 77 degrees or higher temperatures do not test well for rabies after 48 hours. Now you can say, well, Stephen, why would I care about this? Well, what it means is if you have a client who exposed themselves to an animal that may have been dead, maybe they were picking up with their bare hands and it cut their finger, maybe from their mouth, or they were doing something with it, or maybe a dog was involved. That's a problem, because it shows you that these animals can still be positive after 24 hours. But in this particular study, the higher the temperature, the longer the time, the harder it is to test positive. And the last thing we want with rabies is a false negative. That is, when we're finding that the animal is testing negative, but it's not negative, that's actually positive. So let's fast forward and go to some more recent research. I think this particular study occurred in 2014, if memory serves. Before 2014, because that's when the article was published. And what the researchers found was they said that carcasses, and again, they're using much more sophisticated testing equipment because, science progresses. The equipment that we're using is a lot more sensitive. The work becomes a lot more sensitive, so we can test things a longer period of time. What they found was carcasses can be infective for 18 days after death in cold temperatures of 39.2 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, that's pretty cold, but it's not that cold. For us up here in Montana, that's not that cold. 39 is that's not bad. What they also found was that carcasses can still be infective and test positive up to 3 days in temperatures reaching 95 degrees Fahrenheit. Now that's hot. That's for you southern guys. That is pretty hot. So what's the bottom line here? Treat carcasses of animals as if they're still infective. Even animals that are degraded and going through decomposition can still be infective. Don't play with that. Make sure you're taking this seriously when you're working with wildlife. Treat animals, particularly mammals, because rabies is a disease of mammals, but treat animals, particularly mammals, because rabies, you're not going to recover from that, right? So animals that can be rabid, treat them carefully, whether they're alive or whether they're dead. And even when they have decomposition, you need to be thinking about, is this a situation where you can still be infected? And the answer is, yeah, you could be. So you don't want to be the example that says, oh, well, guess what? They're infective for 4 days at 95 degrees. You don't want to be the next research project, right? So treat animals, whether they're alive or dead, as potentially infectious. I don't want to breed paranoia here. That's not my point, but I'm trying to push back against, sometimes we get a little cavalier when we're working with wildlife. Take care when you're working with these animals. Wear your protective equipment, wear your gloves, don't get careless. Treat them as potential zoonotic disease reservoirs, which many of them are. Hope that's been helpful for you. Again, sorry for the short podcast today. I've just been way too busy and wanted to get this out before I started traveling next week. Again, this is Stephen Vantassel. You've been listening to Living the Wildlife. Definitely reach out to me. I'd love to hear from you. You can reach me at wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com, wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. Would love to hear from you. Do take a few moments, if you would, to subscribe to the channel. And again, if you don't want to do it on YouTube, you can definitely visit my page on Rumble, and where I have a lot of my back podcasts there. And again, if you have ideas, suggestions that you would like to hear for future podcasts, definitely let me know. Definitely give me something to do some research on, and perhaps I already have something already prepared for that. So I would love to hear from you. And again, you can join us on Facebook, where you can join us with the Pest Geek podcast family, where you can ask questions and get questions answered, of course, and also to talk about your triumphs and trials within your work in pest wildlife control. You do important work. We want you to be safe. Animals can be dangerous. I hope you're charging enough. But make sure you're not being careless while you're trying to work faster to make more money. We want to keep you around for a while. Again, you've been listening to Living the Wildlife. Why do we call it Living the Wildlife? Because we want you to live the wildlife, not be the wildlife. Take care, everyone.